Hey there, welcome to the Bible in 5. This week you are transitioning into the letters of the New Testament, and so we're going to be spending a number of weeks here reading Paul's letters to the early churches, the early Jesus communities in the ancient Roman world. That's what this block of books in the New Testament is. And so Paul, you read about him in the book of Acts. He was a persecutor of the early church, a Jewish rabbi who became a follower of the Jewish Messiah, and he became convinced that the good news about the death and resurrection of Jesus was for all nations, not just for the people of Israel. And so he was a missionary to a whole bunch of ancient cities around the Mediterranean. He started new Jesus communities. And essentially what happened was he would write letters to these new kind of emerging Jesus communities to help them foster their faith and so on. So his letter to the Romans is one of his longest and most significant letters. And in it, he's addressing a number of issues going on to the church in Rome. And we're going to cover it in 2 videos here. The church in Rome, we find out from the book of Acts, Paul actually never went there before he wrote this letter. He knew lots of people there, he had friends there, but he had never personally visited. And we know from the book of Acts that the church in Rome consisted of both Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians. And right around the time before Paul wrote this letter, a number of years before, the Roman Emperor Claudius had expelled all of the Jewish people from Rome. And so it was about 5 or 6 years before they were allowed to return. And so when they did return to the church, there were tensions between the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians. There were disagreements about what exactly the gospel is. There were disagreements about, did the non-Jewish people have to celebrate the Jewish Sabbath or eat kosher or be circumcised and so on. And they were having tensions and debates and so on. And so that is part of the key reason why Paul wrote this magnificent letter to the Romans, to help them understand more accurately the gospel story, but also the significance of the gospel as a message that goes out to all nations, not just the people of Israel. And that'll become clear as we go into the letter here. So we're just going to cover these first 8 chapters here in the rest of this video. So Paul begins this letter, and he begins by saying what his plans are for the believers in Rome. Paul wants to go to Rome. He wants to make this church not a place of division anymore. He wants it to be a unified church, because he says he wants this church in Rome to be a staging ground so that the gospel can now go even further west. He wants the gospel to spread all the way to Spain, past Rome. And so he begins, basically his letter here is a way of unifying this divided church under the gospel, and that's the kind of the main purpose of his letter. So he begins by developing just a few basic points here in chapters 1 through 4, the first main movement. He talks about how in the non-Jewish world, all of humanity, all the non-Jewish, the Gentile world, has become trapped in sin and selfishness and brokenness. He says the human heart has turned inward on itself. It tends towards idolatry. And so, therefore, humanity is in need of God's grace and God's mercy. To which Jewish people might say, well, good thing we've been shown God's grace and mercy. He rescued us out of Egypt. He gave us the Torah. And Paul says, not so fast. In chapter 2, he says the people of Israel have proven themselves to be just as hypocritical and just as broken and selfish as the rest of humanity. And so his conclusion is that all of humanity, it doesn't matter Jew or Gentile, all of humanity is trapped in the brokenness of sin and selfishness. And so the resolution to that brokenness comes to its high point here at the end of chapter 3, in a crucial paragraph very dense, where Paul unpacks the core of the gospel story, is that it's the Jewish Messiah who absorbed into himself the pain and the sin and the evil of all humanity, so that through his death, human sin could be punished and paid for, and through his resurrection, people could find life and forgiveness and grace. And so part of how he rounds off this first section here is he says that God's whole purpose in sending Jesus as a Jewish Messiah was never just for the people of Israel, and it was not so that all humanity becomes Jewish. He says actually the goal was to create a family, a multi-ethnic family of people who were saved by the Jewish Messiah. And here he turns to the story of Abraham. And he says it's actually not by obeying the Torah or keeping the Sabbath that people are saved. It's by simply having faith in God's promises. That's what constitutes saving faith. And so Paul's whole point here in this first set of chapters, as he sets up for what's to come, is to say salvation is by God's grace. It's through faith in Jesus, not by doing religious deeds, not by obeying the Torah, not by keeping the Sabbath or whatever. And God's purpose was always to have a multi-ethnic family that's spreading throughout the whole world. So you can see why, by making this foundational point at the beginning, what Paul's doing. He's trying to show these Jews and Gentiles that they may have differences about religious practices and so on, but they are one family united in Christ. And he's going to go on to develop those themes throughout the rest of the letter, but these first 4 chapters kind of lay down this core point that Paul is making. The church should be united, not divided along racial lines. It's a multi-ethnic family united by faith in the Messiah. That's the first movement of Paul's letter and kind of the setup and the background. In the next chapters, he unpacks the significance of that for living the Christian life and so on. So we'll unpack that in the next video, but I hope that's helpful to at least get you started reading the book of Romans. Have a good week. See you next time.